With renewed openness between the U.S. and Cuba, we are starting to learn more about the church in the island nation. And joining us now with his insights is Brian Stewart, a longtime missionary and founder of Action Cuba. He just completed his 50th trip to the country, where his interdenominational ministry helps to train and encourage pastors. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Heather.
Well, in light of President Obama's trip to Cuba, what are you hearing from Cuban pastors right now? Do they think that improved relations between the two countries are going to affect them or might affect them?
Well, I think most of the optimism so far is on the American side of the equation. The pastors that I spoke with just a couple of weeks ago are not very optimistic, to be frank with you. Number one, because it's a centralized economy. So all of the influx of money will go to the Communist Party, and they're a little bit pessimistic that there'll be a trickle down that will affect their daily lives. And secondly, they're very aware of the statements of Republican candidates that might want to roll back some of these recent changes. So they're thinking that perhaps this opening could be short-lived if there's a Republican in the White House soon.
A lot of U.S. Christians are interested in traveling to Cuba on short-term missions trips to support the church there. And the president again has announced some new changes, some new twists in how things work between the U.S. and Cuba. Might that enhance the ability of Americans to visit Cuba?
Yes, I think so. I think President Obama is doing everything he can to eliminate the travel restrictions and possibly even eliminate the embargo. What we're looking for on the other side, though, is for the Communist Party of Cuba to make it easier for American missionaries to do religious work in Cuba. We're heavily monitored. We have to get a visa every single time we want to go down there. We're not allowed to minister in two different denominations during the same trip. And there are a lot of restrictions. So, again, the opening is primarily on the American side, and we're looking for Cuba to make some changes on their side as well.
Brian, what are you hearing from the Cuban church? Does it welcome help from the U.S.? And if so, what kind of help?
Yeah, very much so. Cubans are wonderfully hospitable, and everyone I've taken down there on my teams has fallen in love with the people and the culture. And they have a passion to be self-sufficient. Right now, they're not. They're heavily dependent on help from America and other countries. And they would really love to have church-to-church partnerships where people could come down and help them start agricultural projects and other micro businesses that would allow them not only to meet their own expenses, but also to do the community outreach that they're dreaming of doing.
And tell us a little bit about that community outreach. What do they want to do?
Well, there's amazing opportunities, Heather. I've been going down there for 15 years, and just in the last 3 years, Christians, including foreigners, have been allowed to go into orphanages, allowed to go into hospitals, allowed to visit the elderly shut-ins in their homes, whether these people are Christian or not. And so there's a lot of opportunities for the church to go out into society and to show Christ's compassion and to proclaim the gospel. But that does take resources, and Cuban churches just don't have those resources.
What is your take on strengthening the ties between the churches in the U.S. and Cuba? I mean, do you think this is a good idea? Is there a lot of potential, or are you more concerned about pitfalls?
Interestingly enough, I was just on my last trip with some Russian pastors who lived through the fall of the socialist bloc, and they saw a lot of American groups go into Russia. And there was some difficult complications when that happened, when there was just a vast and immediate influx of American churches into Russia. So we're very concerned that Americans go down to Cuba and they do so with humility and with great respect and appreciation for the Cuban pastors who have kept that church alive during some very difficult decades. And as long as Americans go in with the right spirit, I think they're going to be warmly welcomed by their Cuban counterparts, and the results can be fantastic for the kingdom and for the society.
You were mentioning Russia. Was there something negative that happened when the American church went in there that you're concerned might happen in Cuba?
Yes, the Russian pastors who lived through that era back in the early 90s said that the many American groups and churches went over to Russia, to help, but that help came at a certain price, and it had the price of the Cuban churches and ministries identifying themselves with the American organization.
You mean the Russian churches?
Yes, I'm sorry to say that. And so if I can just back up and say that the concern would be that American churches go down there and they want to put their name, their logo, their policies onto existing ministries and existing churches without fully appreciating everything that the Christians have done in Cuba to keep things going for 50 years plus.
Brian, how would you characterize the church in Cuba at this point in time? We've heard a lot of reports of its amazing growth, its vitality. Are you seeing that?
The growth has slowed. It's sort of plateaued. It was a huge opening since about 1998 and a tremendous growth. And now most of the pastors I speak with are concentrating on discipleship and deepening the faith, deepening the roots of their congregational members. And Cuba is perhaps 8 to 10% evangelical now. The numbers differ and it's hard to really know the facts. But you have a large percentage of the population who are true believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, and they need to be discipled now. And many of the pastors don't have the experience or the training or the materials to do that well.
And I know that's where you come in. Do you see any particular reasons for a slowing in the growth, or do you think the pastors are more just concerned that they really focus on discipleship?
Well, the influx was so substantial. It was overwhelming back in the early 2000s that they didn't have the infrastructure necessary to really accommodate all those people and make them feel welcome and plug them into the church. And so their focus is now on discipling and maintaining all of the people that they have and helping those people to really grow in their faith, because there are a lot of strange and false doctrines coming in from all over Latin America. And that's another concern with regards to the opening to America. Cuba has been so isolated that they've been able to maintain a purity of doctrine because they basically have just had the Bible. Now that many other materials are coming in, many new teachings will come in, and the church needs to be wise and needs to be astute as they evaluate those different teachings.
All right, Brian Stewart, it's exciting to hear what's happening. Thanks so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heather.